just let me know when to take it off.
Michael, you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, great. Well, people are still joining in, but we're going to kick this off. Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Rovita. I'm the president and CEO of the Westchester County Association. And if you're here joining us today, you're interested in cybersecurity and cyber resiliency. This has become increasingly front of mind for business professionals such as yourselves. Recently, the WCA ran one of our all-access healthcare breakfasts on the dangers presented by a cyber attack. And this presentation proved to be so popular that we decided to launch a three-part cyber series virtually with our friends from Anatomy IT. So over the course of the next 3 months, we will look at these issues from a variety of perspectives. These are noon lunch and learns, and today's presentation will focus on recent changes in cybersecurity, define essential minimum security standards, and discuss practical funding options, including self-funding, to ensure robust protection even within a tight budget. The next session, which takes place on August 14th, will be about the nexus between artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. And then in the final session of the series, on September 18th, we will walk you through an actual code dark scenario and how to respond to an actual attack with an actual case study. Please remember to register separately for these additional virtual presentations, either through our website at www.westchester.org, or somebody will drop some sort of a link in the chat box here. So if digital is your thing, we will also be hosting, along with Westchester County, the government that is, and the STEM Alliance, the region's first ever Converge conference on digital connectivity. That is a live conference taking place the morning of October 1st with multiple panels, discussions, and networking opportunities. And we'll open the registration for that at some point next week. Now, before we get started, a few housekeeping issues. All participants are in listen mode only. So if you have questions that you want answered, please drop them in the chat. We will monitor those questions and then as they come in, and we will hope to answer as many as possible before the end of the presentation. You'll also receive a recording of the webinar at the email that you registered with. Now I'd like to bring in our moderator, who will then introduce our other panelists. Today's moderator today is Bill Sintiris. He is the CPO of Anatomy IT. He is a seasoned IT professional with decades of experience in IT, SaaS, and cloud, committed to delivering quality managed services. Before joining Anatomy, Bill served as the COO of Amadeus Hospitality, where he led global operations and gained significant experience in M&A integration. So settle in with that sandwich, because after this, you might need a stiff drink. And with that, Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining today. We're really excited to be here and talking about cyber resilience and really, as Michael said, talking about what's the current threat landscape look like. What are some of the minimum things you need to be doing as a business to stay in business, stay running, stay available for your clients, and then also protect your client data. And then obviously the big question that everybody has is, how do you fund it? So we'll talk about that. I'm very excited to be joined by a couple of great panelists here. So first off, I'd like to introduce Kim Kernew. She is the Vice President of Treasury Management Officer at TD Bank. She specializes in treasury management, and she really focuses on commercial banking, covering Philadelphia, Gloucester, Cumberland, and Salem counties. She is also the Government Treasury Management Sales Officer for those counties, as well as some more. Her primary role consists of developing new business, servicing the customer's needs, educating clients and prospects on how to protect themselves from fraud, and managing cash flow cycles and maintaining relationships with the line partners. Lot said there, but she brings a wealth of experience in protecting businesses, and then obviously on the treasury side. So thank you for joining us, Kim. And then additionally, we have Rick Passero. Rick is the Chief Information Security Officer at Anatomy IT. Rick has significant experience in IT and system security. He is a certified information systems security professional, a CISSP. And he has a diverse background. So not only does he have the security background, but he spent a significant amount of time in IT operations, architecture, and leadership. His experience extends beyond healthcare. He also has significant experience in financial services, insurance, legal, and technology sectors. And so, welcome to the panel, Kim and Rick, and thank you for that. I'm going to kick us off by just talking about, what is going on in the landscape, and really in 2023, as the numbers started to get reported in, the number of healthcare data breaches, but all across all segments that occurred in 2023, took the industry by surprise, and all industries. And what we started to see last year is really an increase in threats at the lower end of the spectrum. So you've got the high end targets that are really well protected, and you started seeing the threats go down market into the smaller and medium sized businesses. And you're starting to see a lot of social engineering attacks, direct cyber attacks against those businesses, and then an increase in fraud. So Kim can talk a lot about that. You know, from our perspective, you're starting to see leaders really question whether they're doing enough in terms of investment into cybersecurity. And when you look at a survey, so we read a survey that was focused in healthcare, but it was really asking healthcare leaders, do they feel like their cybersecurity is considered very mature? Less than half of them said that. And even really, when you look at even the half that said that, the reality is that it's evolving on a daily basis. So what you thought might have been very mature 2 weeks ago might change in the next 2 weeks, because what's happening in the space and the evolving threats that are hitting businesses today is really changing at a rapid pace in 2024. Some major events happened this year, and even as of last week, you likely saw that AT&T had a data breach, and so they had data records for phone and text messaging records get compromised, and the word on the street is that they've paid to secure those files. But the reality is once they're out there, right? So as a business, what's that going to do? Well, your records are now compromised. Now your private information potentially has been shared, and then obviously in the case of AT&T, how do they continue to secure that going forward? And did they have the right protocols in place to do so? And what we're finding is they potentially did not when it comes to some pretty sensitive data. So as we look at 2024, what is the new goalpost? And that's something that we'd like to talk today about. And certainly, we'll jump right in and talk about what is the threat landscape looking like today. And so, Kimberly, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you the first question. How do you see the cybersecurity landscape evolving in your business, and how is your business staying in front of it?
Perfect. Thank you. That's a great question. So it's a mixed bag. Things are advancing, and the fraudsters are always one step ahead, unfortunately, right? They kind of know the defense mechanisms that banks and companies are using, and they look for a way to circumvent those backstops. Believe it or not, I see a lot of, same methods that have been around for a while. So phishing, email compromise, getting into systems that way, pirating passwords with a screen scrape, those types of violations. For example, I work with a company, big bakery, and I had the CFO reach out to me, and she said, hey, one of my vendors just sent me a letter through the mail saying they're no longer going to take a check, and they want me to ACH a payment to this new bank information. She had her cybersecurity hat on and thought it was kind of different. So I kind of instructed her, pick up the phone and talk to somebody on the other end at that supplier. And here, phishing emails have been around forever, right? That's a compromise. But what this fraudster had done is actually, went after that vendor's customers, right? Didn't attack that vendor directly, but had reached out to their customers, asking them to redirect payments. So that vendor was unaware that they had had a breach until our customer had actually called them and say, hey, is this something legitimate? So, the technique has been around, but they're getting more forward thinking on how they're using those techniques. And again, things are progressing. I know there's another seminar for artificial intelligence, but that's something down the road that we have to stay ahead of. And I don't want to talk about that now too much, since I know that is slated for another seminar. But, they're always, the fraudsters are always going to be evolving, and we all need to, educate ourselves and stay on top of it and help each other protect ourselves. How we stay in front of it, education, right? I think education is the biggest key there. I try to educate myself by what the latest things are that are out there, and how I can pass that on to my clients and the community, the business community, on how they can protect themselves. So I would say education is definitely number one. We also provide outside resources to our clients and to our communities by partnering with companies such as yours, looking at things they can do where they can take self-assessment as a business owner to really open it up and be honest with themselves and see, where am I at? Am I in a crawl, walk, or run phase with how I've protected the business from a cybersecurity standpoint? Again, connect owners with the other businesses that can help them, right? And then lastly, we provide banking services that help protect their banking accounts and look for ways that they can do business and manage their cash more securely. So those are some, basic things that you can do. I think, the education is going to be the biggest piece of it.
Absolutely. And in the case, in the example that you spoke about, where they got a physical piece of mail coming in, trying to change the way that payments were sent, really shows you that the awareness training that user or that CFO likely had caused them to pause and think, hey, is this right? And reach out to you. So really good example of where education came into play to potentially divert fraud, right? And so really good example. And you mentioned it, and when you and I spoke before this, you mentioned, and not to go too deep into AI, but you brought up a really good point about how AI is being leveraged to potentially commit fraud, and especially with the ability for AI to listen to recording and potentially mimic a person. Can you talk about that just briefly? Because I do think it's something important. As AI evolves, so do the threats.
So really all it takes is 20 seconds of somebody's voice where a whole conversation can be created. If I'm going to provide a reference, if you go to YouTube and you Google, "This is not Morgan Freeman deepfake," it's actually, I think it's 1 minute and 4 seconds of Morgan Freeman actually talking to you. And the question is it really Morgan Freeman? Is it not Morgan Freeman? And obviously it is a deep fake. And there are things that you can pick up on, like the eye movement and lip movement. But the average person, if you're just looking at that and you're unaware and your cybersecurity hat isn't on, you're probably going to be duped by that. So I think, artificial intelligence is great. I think it's going to advance technology. It's going to make the world a better place. But again, there's always those bad apples that take something for the good and are going to turn it around. So I think as this evolves, it's something we definitely need to keep top of mind. All organizations need to, look at the artificial intelligence, how it can help their business, but also how it can also be a pitfall. And doing that self-assessment and making sure that you're protected. But yeah, I know, again, you guys have something in the future planned for that, so I don't want to ramble.
No, but I think it's a great point to be aware of, because even if you're using voice, say, for authentication, it can be mimicked now very easily, to your point. And then if somebody receives a voicemail saying, "Hey, I need you to change my ACH to this new bank account," typically you'd think a voicemail is safe. You know the voice, you know who's calling, and you might do it. But question everything, because you can't confirm until you speak to somebody, live, if it's real or not. So I think it's good for people to be worried about and wary of.
Yep. And just with that, one other thing, I'm sorry, is be careful of your social media posts, right? You're on vacation, you're at the beach, and you're poaching, "Oh, look, it's so-and-so is in the water." Those are where the fraudsters are going to go to pull their information. So just be cognizant of, everything that you're doing, even on your social media accounts.
Yeah, very good reminder, right? It all connects, right? They can use anything against you, or manipulate anything that you have out there publicly. Great. And so Rick, can you kind of talk about the cybersecurity threats and technical vulnerabilities and how they are impacting businesses and potentially share some examples?
Sure. So as Kim said, today's threat landscape is rapidly evolving. We are seeing a lot of the old techniques and threats that we've seen for a number of years just kind of taken to the next level recently. Ransomware is not a new word or a new technique. It's been around for a number of years. That said, we are seeing a significant increase in the proliferation of ransomware. Um, Along with that, the next kind of evolution of that ransomware type attack, we are seeing a significant increase in extortion attacks, wherein an attacker will come in and exfiltrate your data and then simply extort your business to prevent its release. This is like especially sinister and difficult to defend against because in these cases, there's actually no what we call a malicious payload that's like deployed to your environment. So there's nothing for a traditional antivirus, for example, to trigger an alert on. Um, Along with that, we've actually seen a rise of what we call double extortion, where you actually get both of these at the same time, where attackers will come in, uh, encrypt your data, encrypt your systems, lock you out, and then also exfiltrate it and extort you at the same time to prevent its release. So you're being extorted kind of on both sides to get your systems back up and running and also to prevent the public release of your data. So a lot of that happening this year. I would say another big category of threats and vulnerabilities relates to unmanaged or legacy devices. Again, this is not new, but a large number of attacks continue to originate from unmanaged or unprotected devices, which include both personal devices used for work, as well as obsolete network appliances and things like that. These devices often lack adequate security control, so they're easy targets for attackers. As you and Kim mentioned, AI-driven threats are another very large category and increasingly bigger. I honestly, can't tell you what this threat landscape will look like tomorrow, and that's kind of the scariest part of it. When I think about AI, there's a few different categories of threats. I like to kind of break it down into the ingress threats and the egress threats. On the egress side, you have your employees who are potentially using AI, uh, generative AI, large language models, things like ChatGPT, and they could be putting sensitive data into there. Um, there's certainly some risks that come along with legitimate usage of AI tools that have to be governed. It's really hard to even provide like policy recommendations in this regard. Sometimes it's hard to know where to draw that line, something that is okay to do today. Just the nature of this beast is that it's always evolving. So, if a doctor is using an LLM to assist with diagnosis, and maybe today it might be okay if they just depersonalize the information, remove SSNs or names and such. Will that be okay tomorrow? Probably not. That AI might have the ability tomorrow to go and correlate that data in ways that it doesn't today to identify who that is. So we have to be really careful about the data that we are feeding to these AI models, both from a personal perspective and certainly from a business perspective. And then on the other side of it, as you guys mentioned, you've got the kind of ingress side of AI. We are seeing some of those highly sophisticated attacks. Things like, as Kim mentioned, the deep fakes and the voice fake models. But, more than that, what we're seeing is AI being used as a force multiplier for less sophisticated attacks that in the past would have simply been too labor intensive to do effectively. So what I mean by that is, um, you know, especially this is impacting smaller businesses where previously, the juice may not have been worth the squeeze, so to speak, for a threat actor. Now they can simply kind of pump their tools full of a list of possible targets and autonomously attack hundreds or thousands of businesses at the same time to see what hits. So this really is acting as a force multiplier. And some of these threats that we have been facing on the enterprise side or in the mid-market are now becoming more and more real for smaller businesses and different categories of businesses that previously may not have been targets. So that's a really big factor. Um, Next, I would say supply chain attacks continue to be top of mind. These are attacks that exploit the relationship between vendors and clients. These are especially powerful because they basically allow, again, it's a force multiplier. They allow an attacker to, basically take over one system and from there potentially extend their reach into multiple customers of that one supplier. So they are, that's a very attractive target uh, for a threat actor. Uh, Last category I think I'd like to talk about would be business email compromise. Again, as Kim was mentioning, this is not new, very common, but with the rise of AI, I think this has a lot to do with it, where we're seeing much more sophisticated phishing attacks and what we call spear phishing, which is very targeted. The historical thought of phishing attacks being full of typos and all this is really not the case anymore. They can get very sophisticated where they're pulling information, as Kim said, from your social media, from your organization's blog posts and public website to kind of get a sense of what you're doing, and they can leverage that information to craft really sophisticated attacks. If they know that you're on vacation, maybe they know through LinkedIn who your boss is, they could, or who's in HR at your company. They can start to piece all these data points together and make really compelling cases for social engineering. And then once that initial foothold is taken, we often just don't see malicious payloads deployed that in the way that we used to. As Kim was saying, these threat actors will take over an email account, and then rather than attacking that company, they use that as the force multiplier to go after their clients, and they try to live off the land and stay quiet for as long as possible so they can continue these types of attacks. Sometimes over a very long period of time, they'll plant these seeds of oh, we've got a change to our payment methods coming next month, and these things can go on for months. They can get very sophisticated with how they redirect the emails that are going back and forth. Again, all AI driven in some cases, so it doesn't even require a lot of manpower from these threat actors. So overall, it's a lot of the same threats we're seeing, but they're just getting a lot more sophisticated. And we're seeing just a lot more of them against targets that we never would have expected to, even just a few years ago.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And you both said it, right? They're not always new compromises, but they're new ways of getting those compromises at scale, right? So hitting more businesses, hitting smaller businesses, or specifically targeting them. And AI is helping the rapid acceleration of that, unfortunately. And look, we're not here to scare everybody, right? Because there are a lot of things you can do to protect yourself against all of these threats. And a lot of it goes back to some of the basics. So, one of the things, Rick, maybe you could talk about is, okay, knowing all these threats out there, and the threats are evolving quicker than we can sometimes respond to them. But a lot of times those threats are pretty common in what we've seen in the past. They're just evolutions of previous threats that we've seen or fraud activity. What are some basic things organizations can do today? And is there a minimum set of security standards that, organizations can say, hey, if I do these things at a minimum level, I'm going to be pretty protected against these threats, whether I can block the threat, train my users against them, or recover if I do get compromised? What are some of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So that bar has definitely risen in the past few years as far as what that minimal acceptable posture is, if you will. Let's see. So we've got the categories of threats, as I was mentioning earlier, are really just the next evolution of things that we've been seeing for a long time. As Kim was saying, the defenses against many of these types of attacks are actually analog. in many cases, if there's something like some of these attacks we're talking about that are AI driven or deep fakes, there's not a heck of a lot that I can actually do about it as your cybersecurity team. It comes back to the users in a lot of cases and what your processes are. So this basically comes down to user awareness and user training, still probably being among the most critical factors that you can implement to mitigate your risk. Those policies and the procedures and the guidelines that you provide your employees for, how they can use things like LLM, or how they react if they get a request to change where they're sending their ACH payments. Pick up the phone and call your supplier. There's really no digital equivalent to that I can provide at this time that would be as foolproof as that even. So that's, I would say, far and away the most important thing. Just have users that are aware, and trained and ready to defend your organization. The next step is really, I would say, the access control is the most important thing. With the telescoping advancement of and evolution of these threats, you kind of have to assume at some point that you will suffer a compromise. There will be some sort of a security incident that impacts your business. So, the things we do is basically take that for granted, and then think about ways that we can mitigate the damage if that does happen. So, depending on your level of security maturity, there are, different security architectures, things like zero trust, that you can start to look at, but really just comes down to guarding your crown jewels, putting the right controls in place as far as who has access to your data. It's very common, and especially in smaller organizations, for there to be a kind of a file share that everyone has access to everything. And in the past, maybe that was okay. You trust your people. Maybe you're not worried so much about insider threats, but what happens if one of those accounts is compromised? Now all of a sudden the threat actor has the keys to the kingdom in a way that maybe they shouldn't have. If a user doesn't need access to data to do their function, they probably should not have access to it. That's really the simplest way to put that. In addition, there's technical measures around access control. Certainly, having good password policies and multi-factor authentication are extremely important. But that user awareness level and mitigating the damage of what can happen from any given user are really prime there. As far as like pure technical solutions, the market is really demanding endpoint detection and response today. For a lot of years, we relied on antivirus as a technology, as kind of that main line of defense against anything that might try to, attack an individual endpoint or an employer. As these threats evolve, as I kind of alluded to earlier, there are more and more threats that are not deploying what an antivirus would consider to be a malicious payload. There's no virus, there's no, Trojan that's being deployed. Many times they're not encrypting files even. They're getting in using a valid user account, using a valid password that they phished from someone. And they're downloading files and exfiltrating them and then extorting. So, the evolution of the defense there is endpoint detection and response. EDR is antivirus, evolved. Rather than looking at what's happening on a machine and like comparing it to known threats that we've seen in the past, EDR is using that AI and the machine learning for good instead of for evil. Maintaining a baseline of what is good activity in a given network environment, and then reacting appropriately. So it's able to identify things like, oh, hey, this maybe this maintenance worker is downloading the entire contents of the engineering file share. Is that something that is supposed to happen? So questions like that traditional antivirus just doesn't have a response to. It wouldn't even see that activity. So EDR is really definitely part of that minimum security standard. And then lastly, just generally staying up to date, avoiding legacy software, offsite backups are really important for that recoverability. If something does happen, you need to be able to get your data back up. And business continuity, there's a lot that can be done. But I would say that minimum one is really that user awareness, access control, EDR, and then just fundamentals of IT like your backups.
Great. Really good stuff there. And Kimberly, can you add anything further that you might be seeing as you talk to different businesses about fraud and how to protect against it? And then maybe even some things that your organization is enforcing.
Absolutely. I think, as we all speak, you're going to see a lot of recurring themes, right? So, first line of defense, first and foremost, is the prevention begins with people, right? Educate and train the employees at regular intervals, and it's ongoing, right? You may do something today that's going to be ineffective and you need to step it up a month later. Treat security awareness as an ongoing program and not a single project, right? Because it's going to be evolving. We're talking about artificial intelligence and things that are going to come down the pike. I think our business owners can create and sustain a culture that enables employees to build awareness and apply best practices, right? I think, having employee meetings focused around this is something that's definitely going to help. And these are things that you can do at no cost to the organization. I know we're going to get into self-funding some other things a little bit down the road. Create that human firewall, right? If everyone in the organization is proactive and preemptive, you're going to be protected against that cybercrime. And empower the employees to be able to come to, the higher level executives and say, hey, I may have clicked on something, I'm not sure. Where they're giving you the awareness as opposed to whether they're afraid to come and report something. So awareness and education, those are two words that I'll use over and over again when I go out and do these types of seminars. And then to speak to the second part of the question, just some things that our bank and most banks, right, do internally. From an employee standpoint, I think I was talking to some women on the call prior to everybody joining in, our IT department and our teams that are in charge of the fraud will push out emails to the employees to see if we click on a link or we open an email. And if we do, we, fail, our supervisors get notified, and there's an LMS training that we have to take to make us more aware. And, what I find is if I'm at my computer where I have a big screen, I'm more likely to catch those. But if I'm on the road and looking at my emails, I've gotten caught a couple times. So it's just we all want to move on to the next thing, right? Our employees have no malicious intent, but they just want to move on to the next thing. We all have so much on our plates. So that's one of the things that TD and I'm sure other banks are doing internally as well. And, in relation to our customers, once a customer does have a compromise on the checking account, we are moving forward, and a lot of banks are following suit as well with requiring our customers to either put fraud services in place. And I don't care who you bank with. Every bank has these fraud services where we would require our customers to protect those accounts if they choose to keep the same account number, or we require within a time frame that compromised account be shut down and a new account be opened if you choose not to put fraud services in place. Obviously, from my perspective, the recommendation is all the druthers that come with changing an account and moving things over. And there's the potential for fraud to reoccur, look into those fraud services. So those are just a few things where I think, again, minimal cost, but good protection and good place to jump off.
That's great. And I love the term human firewall, right? Because people are at the root of where a lot of these challenges enter the environment. So making sure your employees are trained about the threats and what to be ready for. And even as Rick said, also making sure employees only have access to what they absolutely need to have access to, right? So access control is part of it. So if one is compromised, it doesn't mean everything is compromised. So I think parsing that out is important. And we're getting some good questions in, but maybe before we jump to questions, Kim, can you talk about how your organization has found ways to prioritize the growing spending needed to address the evolving cyber threats? Because we all know budgets are fixed, right? And so every year, as new requirements come out, whether it's fraud, whether it's technical strategies, whether it's training, it requires money. How do you fund these, and how do businesses prioritize that spend?
So I think, our bank, as other banks, are always going to allot funds, whether that means they need to cut back in other areas, reallocate, add additional teams, add additional employees. I think, being a larger company and having possibly more funding, the banks are going to protect that banking ecosystem, right? I think, from a different business, from a different standpoint for our smaller businesses. I think, some of the things that need to be looked at is, review your insurance policies. There was, I believe it was in New England, it was a collections agency for medical, where they had a compromise, they had a cyber attack, ransomware, um, millions of dollars of breach. And, when they went to look at their insurance policy, their cybercrime wasn't sufficient enough, right? So that's, baby steps, the entry level things that you can do. But for this audience, review those insurance policies, partner with your banks, partner with the community resources that are out there by attending these webinars and things like that. And then, work with your CPA, or your finance professional, and look at your line items and where your budget is. And maybe you need to reallocate some of those funds. It needs to be made a priority, even if you need to cut back in another area. One breach could ruin the business and also ruin your reputation. Think about, AT&T is a big company. AT&T is a big company. They've had to go to their customers now and say, hey, we screwed up and we may not have had the best practices in place. I'm sure there's going to be people that may leave AT&T because they feel they're unsecure. So, I think budgeting and making it a point, partnering with your CPA, and finding ways to fund, but look at the resources that are available to you through your banks, through your CPA, through partners like we have on the phone now that can point you in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I would say a lot of businesses are struggling to even get cyber liability insurance today, right? So maybe some investment into some of these technologies, processes, training will allow them to get cyber liability insurance, but also potentially reduce the cost of it, which could help self-fund some of these investments. Rick, any comments on how you can prioritize funding? And obviously, there's a lot of threats out there, so you can't do everything at once.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the insurance is a really good angle. It is increasingly, again, just table stakes just to be in business these days to have cyber insurance. The cost of a breach goes up every single year. It can cost millions and millions of dollars between, the lost business, between the actual incident response services, if you have to, depending on your industry, potential regulatory responses and fines, if you have to notify customers or set up a call center, this gets very expensive very quickly. So the insurance cannot be oversold. You have to have cyber insurance. As you mentioned, having you can work with your underwriters to understand the controls that they are looking for. The insurance market, the cyber insurance market in particular, is evolving extremely quickly, along with the threat landscape. The requirements that they have, or the way they're evaluating and setting their premiums, are not the same as they were last year. So work with them to understand, kind of what they're looking for. A lot of it is going to be kind of what I've laid out here as these minimum controls. If you can attest to the fact that you have comprehensively implemented multi-factor authentication, that your users are trained, that you've implemented some level of access control, you're going to get at least a better deal on your premiums than you would otherwise, for sure. And in many cases, as you mentioned, that's just table stakes just for even getting a policy at all. So the insurance is really critical. You do have to think about how to prioritize the spending. I know not every business can go out there and do all of it. Here I would really just say one of the most important things you can do is to ask for help. Find an expert who can guide you. There are obvious things like what we're talking about today, that basically everyone should do. Beyond that, it's about developing your strategy. You don't want to, spend $100 to protect a dollar, but also in the inverse, you don't want to be underspending on your cyber investments either. So it's important to understand like where the value is, where your risks are, and put in controls to specifically protect your most valuable assets. If you've got, whatever your secret sauce is, a lot of times it makes sense to put your investment dollars into protecting that secret sauce instead of trying to spread it around to protect everything. So that's really the angle, seek expertise who can help you unravel that. There's different tools we have for evaluating investments in security that are different than your traditional ROI. We have a tool called return on security investment that any security consultant could help walk you through. So that'll help you prioritize.
Great, really good. And just to jump to questions, because I don't want to run out of time because we've got some really good questions in here. And maybe we've got about 4 or 5 of them I'd like to get through. So Kim, if I could start with you, what are some news sources, podcasts, or other media approaches that you take to stay up to date on these threats, right? Because it's hitting us from everywhere, but you want to go to sources that you can trust. What are some that you trust?
So I use LinkedIn. Some of the companies, again, like we have on the phone or in the webinar today, I kind of look to see what they're posting, what they're finding. Yep. So there's a company that anybody can look at their publishings. It's US Banker. Again, it talks about these things. There's some internal subscriptions that I have. There are other companies out there that you can subscribe to for free. So I know Strategic Treasurer is somebody that's out there where they do assessments where a business owner can go in and take a test and look at their health as opposed to cybersecurity. So, reading the news, watching TV, it's really a mixed bag. But again, Google, like I said, if you look at YouTube, there's that deep fake with Morgan Freeman, but use the trusted sources, the news stations and things like that.
Perfect. Yeah, that's really good feedback. And Rick, question very specific to higher ed, but I think it would apply to a lot of areas. Like, what are some strong focal points to address in the academic programs that higher ed might be building out?
So not fully understanding that question.
Yeah,
But
I may have asked that the wrong way, but I think there's probably 2 aspects of this to dig into. So obviously, academic institutions need to protect student data, just like any other business needs to protect their clients' data, and they also have to protect for availability. But also, I think there's the flip side of it. If they're building out programs academically, what should they be focusing on with students?
Sure. So that's an interesting question. Don't want to get off on too much of a tangent as far as the state of education and cybersecurity, but it is what I will say is cybersecurity in general is not an entry level role. There's a lot of kids out there right now that are graduating with their cyber degrees, and it's hard to find uses for them. So you know really just the basics of IT from an academic perspective is really that's what I would be looking at. If I was training the next generation of students, I have a lot of people that can, when I do interviews for roles that can, talk to me in depth about very sophisticated, threat modeling methodologies, but they don't know how to, reset a password for a user. So, just from a training perspective, a lot of it just comes down to the IT basics as far as what I would recommend. For protection specific to that environment, higher ed, like a lot of industries, you're going to have a lot of proliferation of unmanaged devices that I was talking about in the first question, which makes it really difficult to secure your crown jewels if you've got kind of a lot of unknowns walking around among them. So that's it's really going to come back to that access control. Segregation is extremely important in environments like that. You don't want to, give every student cell phone access to the database that stores their grades or what have you. Again, just fundamentals of access control is probably the most important factor for something like that.
Great. Well, thanks. And thanks for covering both. I think the question was geared towards what the programs are, and I think you mentioned really IT skills are at the core of what's needed for a lot of the security engineering degrees that are coming out. So making sure that it's not a security compliance only role, that they understand the basics of IT will help them be better at security. And I think that's a really good point. Right. Kim, in your world, maybe it's specific, and you might have a large learning management system with plugins for cybersecurity. But what are you using, and what are you seeing clients using for cyber awareness training?
So we use an LMS system where we have, being a bank, we have regulatory trainings we have to take as well. So they're pushed out to us through human resources. But, most larger companies have something like that where there's required training the employees have to take. Again, I can make a recommendation that, partner, if you use a payroll company, partner with your payroll companies because they do offer some type of HR supplement, the bigger payroll companies, where, they may talk about employee handbooks and they will cover, they will include an area on cybersecurity. That's one of the best resources I think that you can use as a smaller business. And again, if you search out these companies, again, I've referred to Strategic Treasurer. Again, the company on the webinar may be able to point in some other directions, but start with the basic. I would recommend starting with your payroll company and see what they can supplement and backfill you with. That's also usually in a bundle, which is going to make pricing a little more palatable as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point because a lot of those do offer some learning programs from an IT perspective, and looking at cyber, awareness training, phishing simulation, and all of that. We partner with a great company called Nova4 that really does very specific training, and it's very easy to ramp up for employees as well. So snippets of training throughout the year, and then challenging simulations as well. So there's a few out there, and if anybody wants to reach out, we can share some more. Rick, maybe just a quick quick deep dive, right? So this is a question around a deep dive into particulars of how data governance can help limit threat actors and obviously mitigate the potential security failure associated with a threat. So how can data governance help you in those scenarios?
So it's really primarily about limiting the damage. Again, you have to kind of come into the architecture with a mindset of assume compromise. Obviously, we want to put all the controls in place to prevent that we can, but at some point, something's going to happen. Someone will get through. So assume that there is a threat actor who is in command of one of your employees' valid credentials. What can that person do? Again, so in security, we call this the principle of least privilege, which is just the idea of limiting access to the minimum set of data and applications that someone needs to do their job. It sounds simple to say it, but in practice, it can actually be challenging to implement. But it's really probably the most important thing that you can do as far as data governance. I have seen many examples where this was not in place. And again, it's usually some very low value account, maybe a test account, or, the account that a generic account that someone set up to log into a kiosk or, what have you. But then because of the way that, maybe the permissions on the file share weren't set up right, that account actually had access to everything. But, maybe the password for that account is 1234. Don't do that. But once the threat actor gets in, they exfiltrate the data. From the perspective of a lot of your security tools, a lot of the times this looks like perfectly valid activity. It's perfectly normal for a user to come in and download files from a file share. So oftentimes that won't alert. So again, you just like minimize the damage. When I'm securing my home, yes, I've got floodlights, I've got a lock on my front door, but for my crown jewels, for my kid's birth certificate, the title to my house, I've got that in a safe. In addition, so you've got your infrastructure security, which is your firewalls, things like that, and my front door lock. But beyond that, you still want to protect your crown jewels. You put your most important assets in the safe. That's going to be fireproof. That's going to protect you against a number of other disasters, and in addition to being a second layer of defense against that threat actor that is already in your house.
Great. Perfect. And then we have one more question. So I know everybody's given up their lunch to attend this, so I really appreciate that. We've got one more question I'd love to get both of your thoughts on. And Kim, maybe we start with you. The question is really, do you prioritize the spending on cyber risks based upon the likelihood of the risk happening, right? So do you look at your landscape of what business you're in, what vertical you're in, and do you prioritize your spending based upon what's most likely to happen, or is there another pattern that you'd recommend following?
So I think that's a great question. And initially, right, especially if an organization isn't, they do that self-assessment and they find that they have some areas of opportunity to button up. Yes. So to use a basic example, if a company isn't writing checks, but they're doing ACH or wire payments, obviously it's not going to make sense to allocate your funds to protect yourself from check fraud, right? You're going to want to look at what you're currently doing. But then as your business evolves and you look at different technologies, you also want to plan and allocate for future, right? So it's kind of, if you want to think about your, those checking accounts where you have your immediate, your operating account, and then your middle savings account and your long-term growth. I think you want to look, and obviously you need to button up from an immediate standpoint and allocate your biggest amount of dollars there. But as you grow your budget, you want to also look to the future, right? Because you want to be proactive. You don't want to be in a reactive situation.
Yeah, really good. Really good. Rick, anything to add to that as well?
All good points. You absolutely do want to right-size protection. I will say that the likelihood of a threat materializing is a very important factor. Risk is really a function of the likelihood, but also the impact. It's important to consider what the impact of a given event is if you're doing that sort of analysis, in addition to how likely it is. Maybe something, it might be a 1% chance of happening, but if that 1% materializes, maybe that's enough to, put you out of business. So it is important to consider both of those factors, both the likelihood and the impact. And that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier, where it can often behoove you to engage with an expert who can dive deep into that kind of specific analysis. I've worked with, for example, life sciences companies where essentially the contents of a Word document is worth hundreds of millions of dollars because that's the culmination of decades of research. They definitely, that type of organization definitely is going to put different types of controls around the security of their Word documents than most of the rest of us. So it is really important to consider where your risk is, what the impact is, in addition to the likelihood.
Great. Well, thank you. And look, I'm going to wrap it up here. I want to thank Kim and Rick for their expertise. I've really enjoyed peppering them with some questions today, and really enjoyed hearing, what's happening and what we can do to protect ourselves. So thank you both for your time today, and thanks everybody for spending their lunch with us. So hope you found this valuable. And if you have any further questions, you see our information's here. Feel free to reach out to any of us. And with that, I'll say have a great day.